She woke up that morning like she had every other, slowly, half aware, her body heavy from another sleepless night. The air in the room felt thick, still carrying the weight of yesterday's arguments and unspoken words. The man lying beside her had long since turned away in his own silence, lost in the haze of his drinking. It was strange, she thought, how quiet could hurt more than shouting. For years she had tried to hold her family together, to smooth over the cracks, to make peace where there was none. But that morning, she felt something new, a stillness that wasn't despair, but surrender. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet knowing that she couldn't carry it all anymore. The life of a woman often demanded a strength that no one saw, especially when that strength came wrapped in gentleness. She'd faced the kind of difficulties that chipped away at the soul, the loneliness of loving someone who'd forgotten how to love himself. She sat up, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing on the street. The world outside looked the same, dull gray light leaking through the curtains, the smell of stale coffee lingering from the night before. Yet inside her, something small was shifting. It was the kind of silence the old mystics spoke of, the kind that hides redemption inside despair. In that hesicasmo of the soul, where thoughts slow and the heart listens, she felt something stir, not a voice, not a revelation, just presence. Her doubts were still there, whispering that nothing could change, but for the first time she didn't try to silence them. She simply breathed through them, realizing that contrition doesn't always come as tears. Sometimes it comes as a single breath of honesty. I can't do this alone anymore. She moved through the motions, folding the blanket, tidying the room, the familiar rhythm of survival. But this morning was different. Each task felt deliberate, slower, as if she were waking not just her body, but something deeper. She thought of her children still asleep in the next room, their faces soft and peaceful, untouched by the heaviness of adulthood. Family, she realized, was both her burden and her redemption. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer she never dared to say aloud, it had shaped her. The difficulties of womanhood had never been about weakness. They had been her training ground for endurance. She had learned to bend without breaking, to love without reward, and to hope when reason had long fled. That morning, she wasn't sure what she believed in anymore, but she sensed that faith, real faith, might begin in moments exactly like this. The kitchen light flickered as she poured water into the kettle. It was an old ritual, one that had followed her through years of chaos. Coffee first, then the day. She leaned against the counter, letting the steam rise toward her face, and watched how the sunlight fought its way through the blinds, scattering across the chipped table. The house was ordinary, even worn, yet it held traces of something sacred. The quiet endurance of a woman who had never stopped showing up, even when she wanted to disappear. In that stillness, she caught a glimpse of herself not as broken, but as becoming. The Orthodox saints had once written that the soul is cleansed not in noise but in silence. She didn't know theology, but she understood the truth of it. There, between the hum of the kettle and the sound of her heartbeat, she felt her own kind of prayer rising. Wordless, heavy, real. By the time her husband stirred, she had already set the table. The clinking of spoons and the smell of coffee filled the room. He didn't say much, just grunted a quiet morning before reaching for his cup. She looked at him, not with anger this time, but with something closer to sorrow. There was love still there, buried deep beneath years of hurt, but it no longer controlled her. She knew that redemption wasn't about fixing him. It was about finding herself again. As he drank, she turned toward the window, watching the faint blue light of dawn stretch over the street. In that fragile moment, she realized that sometimes redemption doesn't roar into your life. Sometimes it enters like sunlight through a half-closed curtain, quietly, persistently, enough to remind you that morning always comes, even after the longest night. He was still asleep when she returned from the kitchen. his breathing heavy, slow, and uneven, the rhythm of a man long at war with himself. She watched him for a moment, not in judgment, but with a sadness that felt ancient. The sight of him, motionless and unaware, reminded her of Ecclesiastes 1:14. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. For years she had tried to fill the silence between them with words, with care, with forgiveness, hoping something would change. But the truth was harder. Redemption can't be forced on another soul. Each heart must wrestle with its own night. The hesicasmo she had begun to practice, that quiet discipline of stillness, had taught her something essential, that sometimes silence heals more than speech ever could. So she stood there, breathing in the still morning air, and let the quiet speak for her. As she watched him, her thoughts turned inward. There was contrition in her heart, not the self-punishing kind, but the honest recognition of her own weariness. Psalm 51 came to mind. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. She didn't say the verse out loud, but it hummed in her like a hidden current. Maybe her heart had to break, so something purer could grow in its place. The doubts she had about her marriage, about herself, about whether she'd failed as a wife, they still circled her mind like restless birds. Yet, beneath them, something steady was forming. She understood that her role as a woman wasn't to fix what was beyond her reach, but to stand firm in what was within her power, to love truthfully, to endure humbly, and to forgive without losing herself. The difficulties of a woman were never random. They were the soil where strength took root. She sat at the edge of the bed, her hands folded loosely in her lap, staring at the faint light slipping across the floorboards. It reminded her of Proverbs 1, not the verse people quoted to measure perfection, but the spirit behind it. Quiet dignity, quiet endurance. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. It had always sounded impossible before. How could anyone laugh at the future when it felt so uncertain? But now she understood. It wasn't laughter born of ignorance. It was trust. The life of a woman, she thought, is a long walk between chaos and calm, where faith becomes less about answers and more about surrender. And surrender, she was learning, isn't weakness. It's strength in disguise, the strength that doesn't shout, but kneels. She rose slowly and went to open the window. The morning light spilled into the room, cool and blue, like grace made visible. She could see the quiet street outside, mailboxes, trimmed lawns, the same houses that had watched her for years. Everything looked ordinary, yet it carried a whisper of something eternal. Orthodox spirituality teaches that even the smallest things, a sunrise, a sigh, a heartbeat, can become a prayer if met with stillness. She didn't need incense or rituals to feel it. She only needed awareness. The light touched her face, and for the first time in months, she didn't look away. Redemption, she thought, doesn't erase pain. It transforms it, thread by thread, into something useful. Behind her, he stirred. She turned slightly, saw him rub his eyes and glance her way, half awake, half lost. For a moment, she wondered what he saw when he looked at her now, the woman he had married, or a stranger shaped by years of quiet endurance. But she didn't ask. She simply smiled, faint and calm, before walking out of the room. The morning had already taught her its lesson: love without control, hope without illusion, faith without noise. As she stepped into the hallway, she whispered a verse that rose naturally to her lips, like a secret between her and heaven. Be still, and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. The day ahead would bring its share of difficulties, but for the first time she felt ready to meet them, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman learning to live in stillness. When the first real light of morning stretched through the window, it brushed across the table like a quiet promise. She stood there for a moment, watching the golden streaks climb the walls, and something in her chest loosened. For so long, mornings had been heavy, filled with noise, worry, and the endless cycle of survival. But this one felt different. There was no sudden revelation, no voice from above, just light, and the sense that maybe that was enough. She remembered a verse she'd heard long ago, but never really understood until now. His mercies are new, every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Lamentations 3:23. Maybe mercy didn't always arrive as rescue. Sometimes it arrived quietly, like sunlight through tired blinds, asking nothing except to be noticed. She realized that the difficulties of a woman often begin in what seems ordinary. But it's there, in the ordinary, where grace begins its slow work. She moved to the sink, washing a few dishes that had been left from the night before. The water was warm, almost comforting. Every sound, the soft clatter of porcelain, the drip of the faucet, the rhythm of her breathing, seemed part of something sacred. It reminded her of the old writings she had once come across in a book on hesicasmo, where the heart finds peace not through control, but through stillness. She didn't fully understand those words back then, but now they made sense in her bones. Stillness wasn't about doing nothing. It was about being present, even in the small things. Each plate she rinsed felt like a prayer without words, each movement a quiet act of redemption. For years she had chased change as if it lived somewhere beyond her reach, but now she was beginning to see that holiness could grow right here, in the middle of her difficulties, if only she stopped long enough to notice it. After the dishes were done, she poured herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She looked around, the chipped counter, the worn curtains, the little drawings her children had taped to the wall. Everything bore the marks of time, of love, of fatigue. It reminded her of 2 Corinthians 4:7. We have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. She smiled faintly. She'd spent years wishing she were unbreakable, flawless, untouched by pain. But now she saw it differently. Maybe the cracks weren't proof of failure. Maybe they were proof that she had lived. That she had loved through hardship and kept going despite the weight of doubt. The contrition she felt now wasn't about shame. It was about gratitude, the humble realization that even in weakness, she was being shaped into something stronger. The phone buzzed once, a message from her husband. Short and sober. I'll be late tonight. No explanation, no apology. A few months ago, that would have broken her again, reopened every wound she tried to heal. But not today. She sighed, sipped her coffee, and whispered softly, "One day at a time." She wasn't pretending things were fine. She knew the storm hadn't passed. But she was learning what the Orthodox elders had always taught, that redemption is rarely swift. It's a slow, patient weaving of grace through the threads of suffering. The family she longed to heal might not change overnight, but she could. Her heart could. She could choose peace over panic, forgiveness over control. And maybe that was the beginning of a new kind of strength, one the world couldn't measure. She got up, walked to the window, and looked outside. The light had shifted, softer now, more forgiving. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the street lay quiet in the early calm. She thought about how easily she'd once missed beauty like this, buried under doubts and noise. But now she understood what the old psalm meant when it said, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still," Exodus 14:14. Stillness didn't mean doing nothing. It meant trusting that even in her silence, her pain was being carried by something greater. The life of a woman, she thought, isn't about being perfect or unbroken. It's about being present, open, and willing to rise again each morning. The light on her face was warm, steady, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't turn away from it. By afternoon, the house had settled into that familiar hush that comes after lunch, the kind of silence that feels alive, like it's holding its breath. The children were at school, and the air smelled faintly of bread and detergent. She sat at the kitchen table again, not out of habit, but because it felt like the only place where her thoughts came gently enough to listen to. Outside, the sunlight had turned softer, slanting through the window in gold and blue tones that painted the walls in quiet grace. It was strange how peace had begun to visit her in places she used to dread. The same kitchen that once felt like a prison now felt almost like a chapel. She thought of Luke 17:21. "The kingdom of God is within you." It struck her differently now. Maybe the sacred wasn't somewhere distant or unreachable. Maybe it was hidden in the daily rhythm of a woman's life, in her hesicasmo, her breathing, her small acts of endurance that no one saw but heaven noticed. She reached for her notebook, a plain, worn journal where she had once listed prayers, though now it had become more of a reflection log. Flipping through the pages, she saw fragments of herself written between ink stains and tear marks, notes about her husband's temper, her sleepless nights, her doubts about being a good mother, and her quiet attempts at hope. She read a line she had written months ago. "I'm tired of asking for miracles I don't deserve." That sentence stopped her. She could almost feel the despair that had shaped those words. Now, though, she saw them differently. Psalm 34:18 came to mind. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." The difficulties of a woman, she realized, were not signs of divine neglect, but invitations to transformation. Contrition wasn't a wound, it was an opening. Every tear she had shed was a seed of redemption, waiting to bloom in silence. The clock ticked softly above her, steady and indifferent. She thought about her husband again, how distant he had become, how the bottle had built walls she couldn't climb. For years she had tried to pull him back, to argue, to plead. But now she had learned something humbler and truer. Romans 12:12 echoed quietly in her mind. "Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer." Joyful in hope, not because hope guaranteed change, but because it kept her heart alive. Patient in affliction, because impatience only deepened pain. Faithful in prayer, not as repetition but as relationship. She didn't know how long this valley would last, but she trusted the process now. In her Orthodox readings, she had found that real redemption wasn't about escape. It was about transfiguration, about being changed from within even when the outer world remained the same. She stood up and began to tidy the kitchen again. The repetition of movement had become a rhythm of peace. She wiped the counter, folded a towel, straightened the chairs. The air hummed with the quiet steadiness of habit, and she thought of Colossians 3:23. "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord." She smiled softly. Her hesicasmo wasn't sitting cross-legged in meditation. It was folding laundry with love, washing dishes with patience, forgiving before bitterness could take root. The family she nurtured wasn't perfect, but it was hers, her small kingdom, her vineyard to tend even in drought. Every act of care became a thread of redemption weaving through her day, proof that holiness doesn't live only in temples, but in kitchens filled with crumbs and laughter. As the afternoon light began to fade, she sat by the window once more, resting her hands on her lap. The wind outside carried the scent of earth and rain, and she thought of how seasons changed without asking permission. Maybe her heart was doing the same. She whispered softly to herself, not as a ritual but as a remembering. "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Philippians 4:13. The words didn't sound triumphant. They sounded peaceful, grounded. The life of a woman, she thought, is not about triumph but perseverance. Not about grand victories but quiet faithfulness. And as the sky deepened into dusk, she felt a deep, almost sacred stillness wrap around her again. That strange, quiet presence that asked nothing but trust. As evening descended, the house exhaled a kind of tired peace. The golden light of the day softened into a pale blue glow that slipped through the curtains, brushing gently against the walls. She stood by the window, arms folded, watching as the first street lamps flickered on. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the far-off sound of a neighbor's TV formed a quiet orchestra of domestic life. It was in these small, unremarkable moments that she had begun to feel something close to healing. The difficulties of a woman never fully disappeared. They simply changed shape. But now her burdens had a different weight. one balanced by grace. She thought of Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned. She had walked through her own kind of fire, doubt, exhaustion, despair. And yet here she was, still standing, softer but not destroyed. She turned from the window and looked toward the kitchen table where her husband now sat. He didn't notice her at first. His gaze was distant, fixed somewhere she couldn't reach. There had been no grand apology, no dramatic moment of redemption, but there was a strange quiet between them that hadn't existed before. She remembered Ephesians 4:2. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Those words had felt impossible once, almost cruel in their simplicity. But now she understood that patience wasn't permission for pain. It was the strength to love without losing oneself. She no longer felt the need to fix him or to force peace. She could simply live it. That too was part of her hesicasmo, the stillness that begins when one stops fighting what cannot be controlled. Dinner was quiet. The children chatted softly about their day while she served the food, her movements steady and unhurried. The air smelled of roasted vegetables and bread, the scent mingling with the low hum of conversation. There was something holy about it, not in a grand ceremonial way, but in the tender rhythm of family, of simple care. She thought again of Proverbs 14:1. The wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down. The verse had haunted her once, a reminder of how easily she had tried to rebuild with anger or fear. Now, she understood that building didn't always mean constructing. Sometimes it meant holding, mending, forgiving. Her home was imperfect, fragile even, but it was still a home. And that was enough. When the dishes were done and the house quieted again, she went to her room. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of soap and linen. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped loosely, her thoughts drifting between gratitude and weariness. The contrition she felt now wasn't guilt. It was awareness, a deep knowing that even her failures had led her here. She remembered John 8:12. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. She didn't think of the verse as a command anymore, but as a promise. That even in her doubts, her light hadn't gone out. It had simply hidden, waiting for her to slow down enough to see it again. Before she lay down, she glanced toward the other side of the bed. He was already asleep, his face half buried in the pillow, the faint smell of whiskey still lingering. Once, that scent would have made her heart twist with resentment. Now it only stirred a quiet prayer, not of pleading, but of release. She whispered softly into the dimness, Lord, let me see him the way you see him. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the road toward it. And as she turned off the lamp, she felt that familiar stillness settle around her once more, that unspoken peace that lives on the other side of surrender. The night stretched out before her like a gentle sea, vast, uncertain, but calm. She breathed deeply, her mind tracing back through the day. The light, the silence, the slow transformation that had taken root without her noticing. The difficulties, the doubts, the fatigue, they were all still there, but they no longer held her captive. She had learned that redemption doesn't always come as a miracle. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, hidden in the rhythm of ordinary life, in dishes washed with patience, in silence carried with grace, in the life of a woman who chooses, again and again, to rise.